You know, as much as I enjoy the feeling of throwing a rally car down a hill at Mach 3, sliding a jumped up Supra around city streets, or throwing a sports car into 4 lanes of oncoming traffic, sometimes I just want to chill and play something a bit more grounded, a bit more realistic. Nowadays we have plenty of options for this, whether it be Project Cars, iRacing, or the game this footage is from, Assetto Corsa. But 25 years ago, there was only one game that could give you that realistic feeling while still being fun to play. That game was called Gran Turismo. In many ways, the original Gran Turismo was a massive turning point in the racing game space, but to fully understand that, we need to go back several years before its release. In 1992, Nintendo released Super Mario Kart for the SNES, which would go on to be a massive hit. Now, you might wonder why I bring this up. Mario Kart doesn't share anything in common with Gran Turismo. You're right, and that's exactly why I bring it up, because before Gran Turismo, Mario Kart was the standard for what racing games were supposed to be like. This became apparent when, in 1994, while trying to find games to launch for their new PlayStation, Sony was approached by a then 27-year-old Kazunori Yamauchi, who I'll refer to as Kaz for the rest of the video. Kaz approached Sony with the idea of a track-focused racing game, in the same vein as games like Pole Position or IndyCar racing, but instead of being focused on almost exclusively race cars and high-end sports cars, it would encompass a wide array of cars, mainly cars that the average person would actually own. And it would feature a, for the time, very realistic physics simulation, giving the player a real sense of how the car feels to drive in real life, to which Sony said, no. They argued that players wouldn't want something as boring as a simulation, so instead they tasked him with making a Mario Kart clone. And in December of 1994, coinciding with the launch of the PS1, we got MotorToon Grand Prix. It's an alright game, goofy graphics, wacky tracks, and power-ups as you'd expect from any good Mario clone. Although, while developing the physics for MotorToon, Kaz and his team at Polyphony Digital started implementing some of the simulation aspects that he had originally envisioned. And after MotorToon posted, not stellar sales, but still fairly decent sales, he was given greater creative freedom to then make MotorToon Grand Prix 2. Which went on to do very similarly to its predecessor. Although, there is one major difference. If you completed the game on the highest difficulty, you would gain access to a mode where you could drive both a Formula-style race car and an American stock car. At the time, this seemed like just an innocuous extra put in for shots and goggles, but soon, this would make a lot more sense. After the release of MotorToon 2, Kaz and his team of less than 20 were finally given the green light to make their vision of the real driving simulator. After a grueling crunch period where many members of the team reportedly slept in the building, including one story where Kaz himself spent so much time in the studio that at one point he walked out to take a much needed break in just pants and a t-shirt, only to be met with the cold winter air. He then heavily questioned how long he had been at work. But after all the effort they went through, whilst also trying to target a release date in the holiday season, what did they manage to come up with? Gran Turismo was an absolute game changer. Immediately it smashed sales expectations and would go on to be one of the single best-selling games on the PS1, moving just shy of 11 million units. This would only be rivaled by Final Fantasy VII, another legendary title in its own right, and Polyphony's next entry into the series. But why was Gran Turismo 1 so successful? To help me answer this question, I consulted several chill content creators who have a much longer history with the series than I do, and I asked them a few questions on what they thought made the series what it is.
Obviously, with the first Gran Turismo being so revolutionary as it was, you know, how it really was the first game where it really truly felt like, oh my god, those are real cars that I've seen in real life or maybe own myself, and I can drive these, I can do what I want with them, I can customize them. Like, wow, you know, it was like a huge thing back then. And I think that's what initially drew like a lot of attention from people, because it really like revolutionized racing games. Because prior to the first Gran Turismo, you had stuff like the earlier Need for Speeds or test drives that focused more on like supercars or really fast cars, or had fantasy cars altogether. And Gran Turismo really took a risk in that they were like, okay, we're gonna take all the shit boxes from the real world, and you can buy them, you can race them, and you can climb your way up to faster stuff. Yeah. That was like a huge appeal back then, before I was like born even. And I totally get it, right? And especially because of how good it looked for a PlayStation 1 game, especially Gran Turismo 2.
To really get a deeper understanding, we have to look at the specifics. Let's start with the game. The gameplay and feel of Gran Turismo 1 was very different from many of its contemporaries. I would describe many of the other racers from that time by basically saying they feel as though the game world moves around the player, especially in the early 3D days of games like Super Mario Kart and Cruisin' USA. This was also felt in the camera, which was almost always locked in a fixed position behind the car. Gran Turismo was a fair bit different in that you felt like you were a part of the world. You could feel every little detail of both the cars and the tracks, although by modern standards it was fairly primitive. The biggest example of which being how the game handles bumps and changes in elevation. That is to say, poorly. But even taking that into account, this was still leagues ahead of basically every other racing game that was out at that time, and those that could rival it in terms of realism couldn't rival it in terms of presentation, music, sound design, or, and this was a big selling point at the time, just pure content. To give some context for this, I'm going to compare it to 3 games of the same era: Mario Kart 64, Need for Speed 3, and Colin McRae Rally. All of which were amazing games in their own right, and arguably still hold up pretty well today. Here's how many tracks each game had. To be fair, Gran Turismo isn't winning any awards here, but when we compare the number of cars, based on these numbers you'd expect maybe 30 or 40 to be impressive, because anything else would be way too taxing on the hardware. They put in 180. That was absolutely insane for 1998. Although, that's not entirely accurate, because Gran Turismo, as we'll very clearly see in later installments, really like to have many variations and model years of the exact same car. So, in reality, there are more like 140 distinct cars in GT1, but that's still a massive achievement for the time. The best part was, not only do you have this massive car list, but you can also upgrade and tune the cars exactly to your liking, with various engine components, weight reduction, different types of tire compounds, and even adjustable gearing ratios all being available to the player. There were almost no racing games then that had a system as complex as this, and even now, this kind of tuning ability is usually limited to pure simulators, and Forza. Another thing that was unique to Gran Turismo but didn't necessarily contribute to its success was how it challenged the player. Unlike other racers, you couldn't just progress linearly through a series of races until finally getting access to the final event. No, you first had to prove to the game that you were quick enough to even be allowed entry into the events. This was done through the license tests, which were a series of small events that would test the player's ability to handle the car in all situations, and if you're going for gold, your patience. If you played basically any racer more realistic than Outrun, then getting a bronze medal shouldn't be too much of a challenge, and that's really all you need to get access to the events. But where's the fun in that? Because there are few feelings as good as grinding away at a license for hours at a time to then be rewarded with a car significantly faster than anything else in your garage. And it feels good because you earned it, and you now get to go drive something that feels both deserved and exclusive. And the challenge doesn't just end there, because the races aren't exactly a cakewalk either, with each track and lineup of opponents posing a different challenge every time you start up an event. The events themselves also put greater emphasis on the car collection aspect of the game, as almost all events had specific requirements for the type of car allowed in each race, so you'd have to go out of your way to get a varied car list if you wanted to compete in all the in-game events. and the game also gives you the freedom to compete in any event you want, as long as you have the car and license required to compete. This meant that no two players would play through the game in the same way, giving it even more character. Speaking of character, I need to give a mention to the music and art direction. These were that little something extra that made GT1 extra special for its time. Whether it was the 3D medals after you beat a license test, the satisfying sounds of the menus of the tracks that would play on the menu screens that were specific to whatever screen you were on. Gran Turismo was able to make a vibe unique unto itself, and without taking away anything from its core gameplay. However, despite being massively influential on the racing games that would follow, and still a very good game in its own right, it's not without problems. The progression was a bit on the shorter side, as well as the in-game track list, meaning you'd see many tracks repeating after only an hour or so of gameplay, and the aforementioned physics. But basically all of these would be addressed in the next installment in the series. Gran Turismo 2 was, in many ways, only an incremental step up over the first installment, although that's not necessarily a bad thing, as GT1 was already pushing the PS1 to its limits. GT2's main improvement was in its polish and in its content. In terms of polish, it was mainly the small but very important things that were improved upon, like how they fixed the car's tendency to want to enter the stratosphere on jumps, or how they made the progression both longer and also more varied in terms of length, regulations, difficulty, and track selection. The biggest change came in the quantity and quality of the game's content, because, as mentioned previously, GT1 was a bit on the shorter side, especially if you didn't find passing the license test to be particularly difficult. But GT2 fixes this by both increasing the number of license tests from 24 to 60, and increasing the number of races in the campaign substantially. The number of unique courses was also increased to a whopping 27 tracks, including the first real-life tracks of the series in Laguna Seca and Pikes Peak. Speaking of Pikes Peak, this was also the first Gran Turismo to feature rally racing, which, although not perfect, especially not this early into the series, was a nice addition that would be well known throughout the series. Oh, and if you thought the 180 or so cars in GT1 were impressive, GT2 says, watch this. That's right, 650 cars in 1999. That's more than even FH5 had at launch, 22 years before it came out. Gran Turismo 2 also had a more pronounced style than GT1 as well, both in the menus and especially the music. The music in GT2 is the start of what I could best call Gran Turismo's sicko era in music. These are the songs that will forever be etched into the backgrounds of video essayists. Many of the original songs came courtesy of composers Masahiro Ando and Usami Ohira, although much of Ando's work only was available in the Japanese release, including iconic tracks like Moon Over the Castle and Blue Line. That's also something else I wanted to highlight, which is the regional differences between the versions. For 98% of the game, all the versions are the same, save for the language differences, although there are some notable examples of changes, like how when comparing the PAL and North American releases, PAL got a worse licensed soundtrack for their in-game events, and in return, we got license tests that can be borderline impossible. But overall, I think Gran Turismo 2 was a decent step up from Gran Turismo 1, and a good starting point for someone looking to get into the series and wanting to start in the PS1 era, although the series would change dramatically going into its next era. When I asked other creators what was their first Gran Turismo, I got an even split of those who started with both Gran Turismo 1 and Gran Turismo 3, although I reckon most people probably started on GT3, especially those around my age. Funnily enough, during the writing process of this video, I mentioned to a couple of coworkers that I was working on a Gran Turismo project, and that despite growing up with a PS2, I never owned or at least never played a Gran Turismo game as a kid. And they seemed a little surprised and said, I feel like growing up it seemed like every PS2 came with a copy of Gran Turismo 3, which is actually fairly accurate as it was often sold in bundle packs with the console or in buy the system get a game free deals. And it seems to have done pretty well, as Gran Turismo 3 is the single best-selling game in the series, and would have been the best-selling PS2 game as a whole if it weren't for San Andreas. GT3 is arguably one of the best games in the series, and it featured many of the same aspects that made the first two games great, but with that extra level of polish.
Yeah, favorite. I mean, again, it's GT3. I mean, for a while it was tough because before going back and playing them for the past few months, now that obviously I've got a channel and everything, my last time playing through them was sort of like, it's hard to say, but I think it was around early 2010s, like 2011, 2012, that sort of time. And then for a while I thought, GT3, so special to me, but I always sort of took with the general opinion that, GT4 was better, it was just the same thing, but with more cars, more tracks, blah, 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 etc. And that I like GT3 more just because it was what I started with, sort of thing.
Right.
But then coming back to it, and then obviously not just playing it myself, but watching other people play it and just sort of understanding how it's been designed is made me appreciate GT3 a lot more. Just sort of how all the Gran Turismos, the earlier Gran Turismos were all open-ended, of course, but with GT3 it felt like the decisions you made had the most impact, sort of for good and for bad. Right. So you could get stuck very easily, but also you could make something incredible happen, and when it happened, it was a lot more interesting, like building a specific car for a specific event to win another car that you didn't expect, or maybe you already knew for a previous playthrough or whatever it was. I just loved all of that, and I felt like GT3, when I did that, it was the most meaningful, or when, not even me, but seeing it happen to other people as well, it just felt the most meaningful. And I guess that's kind of what I look for in a game, or a racing game like Gran Turismo.
As is going to become apparent very soon, with every Gran Turismo after GT2, there's almost always an upgrade in the graphics and physics department. So GT3 looks and feels better than 2, GT4 looks and feels better than 3, etc. So while that is a positive that every Gran Turismo game has, I probably won't mention it going forward. GT3 also overhauled the progression, now being laid out more linearly, although you could still choose to do the events in whatever order you wanted. They also now incorporated one-make events into the main progression, which would be an on-again, off-again occurrence in the series going forward. To be honest, the biggest improvement I noticed between GT2 and 3 was how well the game presented its vibe. GT3 has a strong visual style present as soon as you get in the main menu, and it gives the game a certain character that makes it unique in the series. That, and like every Gran Turismo in the Sicko era, some great tunes all throughout the game. Although, as much as I think GT3 is one of the better games in the series, it does have a few problems that take it down a peg in my book. Due to the somewhat rushed development of the game, and the fact that they had to entirely overhaul the physics, modeling, and lighting models going onto the PS2, the game lacks the massive volume of content that GT2 had, with GT3 having almost 10 fewer tracks and less than a third of the car list when compared to GT2. They also overhauled the late game progression from GT2, but now instead of having a good 10-15 hours worth of extra content, you now had days worth of late game content, which sounds good until you realize that most of the late game is either 10-lap, 10-race championships in cars ranging from Le Mans spec race prototypes to Toyota Yaris's, or endurance events which could take upwards of an hour just for one event. And remembering how limited the track list is, when you get to your 6th time driving 10 laps of test course, special stage Route 11, or definitely not Monaco, you probably want to stop playing for a while, or at the very least just start a new playthrough from the beginning. There are also some minor things like how they removed the used car dealership or the infamous Escudo glitch, but to an extent those are just small nitpicks. Overall, GT3 was still a very enjoyable experience, and I could see someone arguing for it being the best in the series. But for my money, that honor would go to its successor. This is the game. Close your eyes and think of the greatest racing game of all time. It's scientifically guaranteed that this is the game you thought of. Gran Turismo 4 is seen by many as the single greatest game in the franchise, and arguably one of the greatest racing games of all time. In the same leagues as games like Burnout 3, Midnight Club 3, and Need for Speed Most Wanted, among others. Each of these games are what both defined an era in gaming for many, but also laid the groundwork and expectation for the racing games we have today. But what made GT4 so special?
For me, it has to be Gran Turismo 4. Just, I don't know how to explain it. It just has like a certain charm. It always feels nice to come back to that game, seeing the vast majority of content you can do, like random competitions, manufacturer events, special conditions, the big selection of cars you have in there. It's just like, it's always a joy coming back to that game.
What made GT3 so great, so having the incredibly good graphics for the time, especially on a console that was running at like such low specs. Like the PS2 was like notorious for running incredibly well despite its very low system specifications, and GT3 was a prime example of that. And then GT4 managed to somehow enhance those graphics even more, to the point where you could even run it at 1080i on some occasions, which is insane. Like, just imagine being in like 2005 and then running a PlayStation 2 game on it's essentially full HD. I mean, it's interlaced, but still technically HD. On a TV screen. Now that was back then like really rare. I think it was one of like 6 or 7 games on a PlayStation 2 that could just do that. So it had some really groundbreaking features.
I guess it's not much of a surprise if I say it's GT4. I think it's because that game gets the perfect mix of just authentic driving while still fully realizing it's a video game. I feel like that's something that racing games generally started to forget, that they are video games and they need to make things fun, and they need to design, the career around, like, making you use different cars and upgrade stuff. And I think GT4 nails that the best. Now, if you know what you're doing, you can absolutely break the game and make it way too easy. But just like the amount of events, the amount of cars you have on offer, and also just giving you reasons to interact with it, thanks to prize cars or a decent economy, it just makes that one the most satisfying to play. It kind of feels like this huge RPG where you can go in any direction and it all just kind of works. Everything just clicks together,
Personally, I think GT4 is special because of how it incentivizes the player to keep playing the game. Everything about the game's presentation, the soft-lit menus and wide aesthetic, almost like the Frutiger Aero software design of the time without the corporate sheen of places like Microsoft. The game's basic features, like having, in my opinion, the best rendition of the used car dealership in the series, giving the player dozens of cars that are cheap enough to buy with a starting budget, meaning you really get the freedom to choose how you want to start the game. And the used dealership itself is so diverse that, with a couple small exceptions, you can almost beat the entire game with just used cars. It also teaches the player basic car mechanics by having almost every used car require an oil change to bring the actual performance of the car in line with its intended specs. And the game gives the player an immense amount of things to do, whether it's the main leagues, the international leagues, the one-make races that have literally more events than the league and international races combined, the driving missions, or the endurance races. GT4 gives the player so much to do. However, and this may be painful for some to hear, GT4 is not a perfect game. Gran Turismo 4 has some issues which are hard to ignore, even on a first-time playthrough. In some cases, especially on a first-time playthrough. You know how I just mentioned how GT4 gives the player so much to do? Because of how they structured it, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you can explore the events and missions the devs made to create a unique experience every time you boot up the game. But on the other hand, this game is ridiculously long, and absolutely loves wasting your time. The most egregious example of this are the license tests. GT4 features the most license tests of any Gran Turismo game, at a whopping 80. 85 if you include the bane of a casual player's experience, the coffee breaks. And to me, that's not even the worst part of the licenses. The worst part is how every license features 3 one-lap guide runs where you do a guided lap around a track in some of the slowest cars in the game, and often around some of the longest tracks in the game. IA-15, I'm looking at you, which makes the licenses take even longer. Side note, I was going to make a bit about specifically how long it would take for you to complete each license, but looking back on it, it kind of stopped being genuine criticism and started entering the realm of nitpicking, so I axed the bit. Check out my streams or Discord if you really want to hear it. The game also likes wasting your time in the races and events more so than races, with the biggest example being the one-lap magic events in the latter half of the missions. These often have ridiculous wait times before you can start driving, while you wait for all the slower cars to get going, and the races like wasting your time for just having so many per event. Even the beginner leagues have 5 races per event, 2 more than is standard in the series, meaning it could take significantly longer before you're awarded or given enough cash to get something significantly quicker to drive. This, combined with the extended license tests, mean that the game somewhat alienates casual players who still want to experience the simulation mode. Funnily enough, while writing this video, I was talking with someone who is new to Gran Turismo and started with 4 after hearing its praises, but they almost immediately wanted to grab a completed save file with all the licenses done because of the sheer time it takes to go through them for a new player. Although I will say, it's a good thing we're playing GT4 in the 2020s. With the power of save states and the turbo button, many of the time-consuming parts can be skipped by running the game on an emulator, which, I think in retrospective, makes the game seem a lot more enjoyable as a whole, and GT4 actually introduced a feature for when the player encounters a race they don't want to do, B-Spec mode, which, especially when combined with the aforementioned turbo feature, means you can blow through unwanted 10-lap races in just a minute or so. GT4 also has 2 problems which either started with or started to become more prevalent in GT4, and are present in almost every game that would follow. That being the oblivious and often inconsistent AI opponents, and the stiff camera. I'll let Eden elaborate on the latter point. You made a big stink about this, and I had never heard anyone even mention it, which was the camera in Gran Turismo games.
My worst enemy, yeah.
I never heard anyone make as big a stink about it as you, and it's not like you went on forever about it, but like, you factored that in as much as like the driving model almost, and I'm like, I never even noticed it all that much.
I hate the fucking stiff camera. This was the Gran Turismo where they introduced this fucking stiff camera. I actually had to get used to like the bumper, not the bumper cam, the hood cam, but once I did, it was fine. And then I actually really started to enjoy this game quite a lot, and I played this so much. I mean, you interact with the game based on what you're seeing on the screen.
Yeah.
So if the sensation you get from controlling the car based on the camera doesn't feel right, the entire car doesn't feel right, the entire game doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
Like I've done like a whole video on racing game cameras, and I even interviewed someone who worked on Art of Rally, which you may know, to just talk about cameras and to just kind of like underline how important they are, because they are what's connecting your eyes and what you're seeing to the game. Like cameras have such a huge effect on not just racing games, any game, and there's an absurd amount of time that goes into fine tweaking how cameras work in games to make sure it feels right, because it's that important.
On the topic of the opponents, while GT was never really known for being exceptional on the AI front, it becomes more apparent how little time was put into the AI in GT4 onwards, with them often being completely oblivious to the player and their movements, and having some very inconsistent performance, with some opponents being the literal AI recreation of Ayrton Senna, and other times being more of a Nicholas Latifi. I do hope that if Sophie AI leaves the development stage and actually gets implemented properly into GT8, we might see an improvement in this department. Now, having said all that, I want to make one thing clear. I have a deep appreciation for Gran Turismo 4, and I do agree with the general consensus that it is the best in the series. The only reason I put this game under greater scrutiny than the last 3 is that almost no one ever does. And as much as I might really enjoy this game, it's not perfect, but damn it if it isn't close. Because when you get the perfect vibe from the music and presentation, and land on a car and track combo that feels just right, for a few minutes you understand why people hold this game in such high regard. Paraphrasing the words of the great Paul McCartney,
It was great, it sold, it's
Bloody Gran Turismo 4.
shut up.
Gran Turismo 5. Gran Turismo 5 had the longest development period of any Gran Turismo game as of now, coming out nearly 6 years after Gran Turismo 4. But just because they didn't come out with a mainline title then, didn't mean they weren't busy. A year after Gran Turismo 4, we got Tourist Trophy, also known as Gran Turismo with bikes, because it was just Gran Turismo with bikes. In late 2006, we got the first PS3 Gran Turismo in Gran Turismo HD Concept, which was really more of a tech demo for some of the new features GT5 would have. GT3 also got a lot of these during and after its development. Then, in late 2007, we got Gran Turismo 5 Prologue, which, similarly to HD Concept, it was another sort of technical showcase, but this time with a lot more cars and tracks, a decent, if relatively short progression, and a fully functional online mode, making this the first proper Gran Turismo release to feature online play. They also treated this somewhat like a full release, selling it for $40 at launch. In 2009, we got Gran Turismo for the PSP, which was basically just the handling and most of the cars and tracks ported from GT4, but on the PSP, and featuring a weird arcade mode-like progression. It was alright and sold actually pretty well for a PSP game. But finally, in November 2010, after nearly 6 years of waiting, we got the next entry into the Gran Turismo franchise. Actually, before we get to that, I have to give some context for that time because Polyphony wasn't the only studio who was cooking throughout the late 2000s. A few months after GT4 came out, Microsoft released Forza Motorsport as a direct competitor to Sony's singular racing titan. And, to be fair, as much as I like FM1, I'd still much rather have GT4. However, Forza Motorsport did introduce some key features that players have been clamoring for as early as the first Gran Turismo. Stuff like body modifications, variable time of day settings, the ability to paint your car. Yeah, no GT up to that point actually let you change the color of your car after you bought it, and there were 0 livery options. And a really impressive one for that time, fully functional online multiplayer. And they had all these features back in 2005. GT5 took so long to develop that Forza were already on their 3rd installment by 2010. So, knowing all that, was Gran Turismo able to take back their lead in the market over Forza while also improving on the games that came before? Sorta. Let's start with what's good. Gran Turismo 5 cranked the content up to 11, with the car list breaking the 1K threshold after all the updates, including many new cars from exotic brands like Lamborghini and Ferrari, and the track list totaled 77 circuits. They brought the online mode from Prologue onto the full release, making it the first mainline entry in the series to do so. They also added the ability to paint cars, sorta. You couldn't just paint the car whatever color you wanted. Instead, every car you bought came with its own little paint token thing that meant you could paint any other car in that color. Don't really see why they couldn't just put in a normal paint option like every other racer, but that's neither here nor there. They also started getting real motorsports involved in the making of the series. The most prominent example was the Jeff Gordon Racing School, which, as a southerner with a strong passion for NASCAR, I really enjoy. Except for the fact that Jeff himself looks like he was upscaled from 240p. This would also be, in my opinion, the end of Gran Turismo's sicko era in music, because while the original OSTs of the games that would come after weren't bad per se, they weren't exactly that unique either, besides just having a sort of jazz flair every now and then, and didn't immediately sound like they had come from a Gran Turismo OST like the games before. They also improved the graphics and physics like every other release, which I think I really like. I like how Gran Turismo 5 looks. Although I started with the Forza Motorsport games and have hundreds of hours in Motorsport 4, I personally say GT5 looks a bit better. That's more down to where the game's strengths lie. Generally, FM4 tends to have more detailed car models with a higher polygon count and higher res textures, while GT5 tends to have more dynamic and realistic lighting. So it all depends on what you prefer. And here where things get a bit complicated, because more than a few people say this game is the best in the series, right up there with GT4, or say it's their favorite because it's the one they started with, which is fair enough. However, I also know a number of people who would argue, with very valid points, that this is the worst mainline game in the series.
If we're gonna be fair, I think the worst Gran Turismo, and this might break some people's hearts, is probably 5. Now hear me out. I like the game. There's a lot of people that like the game. But I think it like for a game from 2010, especially if we're considering it released after Forza Motorsport 3, which was such a huge jump, right, in fidelity and just car feeling, etc. It wasn't quite there. You have a shorter career. You don't have any one-make races anymore. You have this entire weird concept with standard cars and premium cars that nobody really liked. So I think Gran Turismo 5 stumbled the most, but I think it's still fun, right? And it's also not the one that I like the least, but I think I can acknowledge that one probably had the most amount of mishaps.
Okay. What do I think of GT5? I think it's very good. As will become more apparent later in the video, I honestly don't think there's a single full release with the Gran Turismo name that I could call a bad game in good faith. And GT5 isn't even just an okay game, it's a good game that I would recommend someone to check out if they were new to the series. Actually, I'd say this, GT4, and GT2 are probably the best starting points for someone looking to get into Gran Turismo. Although, there are still some notable issues, some major and some marginal. One major issue is the progression, but that really depends on whether you did or didn't like the progressions that came before. Because in contrast, GT5 is much easier, much quicker to get going, and the license tests are completely optional. So if you want a more beginner-friendly experience, GT5 is much better for you. But if you want to be challenged, you might have to go out of your way to find it. They also didn't exactly balance every event. One notable example of that is the sports truck race brought back from GT4. The main reason being there aren't any trucks in the main dealership, so you have to find them in the used car dealership. I've been playing for over 40 hours and still haven't seen a truck. Which reminds me, remember when I said GT5 has over 1,000 cars total? That's a bit off, for two reasons. One, this is the first Gran Turismo to have a standardized international release, so the Japanese version is the same as the American version, which is the same as the French version, etc. This doesn't cause any issues, and I overall see it as a good thing, but it did introduce one problem, that cars that were called or marketed something in one region might be called or marketed as something else in a different region. Polyphony solution? Add all of them. Which is how we got stuff like a total of 20 Mazda MX-5 NAs, which is the most notable example, but is far from the only example. And two, the fact that over 3/4 of the car list are models ported from the last two games, meaning the majority of your cars are going to be the, quote, standard cars, unlike the premium cars modeled just for the current gen. And unless it's a new exotic manufacturer, a race car from the past few years, a concept, or a GT kart, chances are it's going to be an old model. The game also separated B-Spec mode into its own separate progression, meaning you could no longer use it to skip unwanted events. Although you could at least name and slightly personalize your driver, which was kinda cool. So overall, GT5 is still a solid game. Although I could see someone having their grievances with the changes introduced, as a whole, it's still a fun game. Gran Turismo 6 is not necessarily the worst Gran Turismo, but it is the most unfortunate. This mainly comes down to when it was released, coming out 2 weeks after the PS4's launch date, but it was stuck on the PS3 with no way to play it on current gen hardware. That likely contributed to its below average sales numbers. While 5.2 million normally seems exceptional even for a AAA release, It becomes less impressive when you realize that was less than what GT5 Prologue sold. It also was seen as only an incremental upgrade from GT5, similar to how GT2 was to GT1, although this time GT6 took away many of the features the last game was built on, like how they started trying to take away player choice by forcing the player to choose the same starter car, or how they removed some of the variation in early car selection by outright removing the used car dealership. Although they also started collaborating with various manufacturers for a new project called Vision Gran Turismo, or Vision GT for short. Vision GT is a cool idea for car builders to experiment with new concepts and in some cases develop them into production models, but in-game they usually don't play many major roles. They did finally iterate on the performance points mechanic added in GT5 by making some races have a limit on how fast your car could be, which was taken straight from Forza, but hey, I'm not going to complain because it is a good feature to fuel progression. Overall, GT6 was a decent enough experience on its own, however it was held back by its late release and lack of innovation from its predecessor. Although, going into the next release, I think Polyphony may have overcorrected a bit when people said GT6 wasn't innovative enough. When Gran Turismo Sport released, many people criticized it for changing far too much between it and what came before, mainly in its change in focus. GT Sport shifted its main focus from the long progression and detailed single-player experiences of the previous games to one that was far more simulation-focused. Actually, simulation's a bit of a misnomer. In reality, GT Sport was really catering more towards the esports audience, as its title may suggest. This means that at launch, GT Sport had basically zero single-player progression, unless you counted the license tests or, the driving school. Yet GT Sport makes a big deal about teaching the driver proper driving etiquette and racing technique. They even have a couple short videos on racing etiquette that you have to watch before entering Sport Mode. Oh yeah, did I mention Sport Mode? It's the primary mode the game is focused on, with it being a sort of online league mode, allowing for players to compete in either daily races, of which they had 3 that would start every 20 to 30 minutes, or larger championship races, which usually happen far less frequently, although with the release of GT7, all daily races only change monthly, and there are no more championship races since then either. In Sport Mode, you would be given 2 ratings for your driving, one on how fast you were based on your finishes in races, and the other being your sportsmanship rating. Basically, a rating to describe how cleanly you drive, with both of these rankings being taken into consideration when you go to join a Sport Mode lobby, so you're more likely to get paired with people of similar pace and ability to drive cleanly. This is a cool idea that I like as a sort of esports ranked mode but in real time, but in practice, it still had a few kinks they needed to work out. One issue many players brought up was with the new penalty system introduced in GT Sport. It was made to curb drivers from driving dirty and to have more of an effect besides just impacting who they got paired with in lobbies, but its actual moment-to-moment decision making could be a bit, let's say, inconsistent. But overall, the system was actually alright at deterring people from driving super recklessly. GT Sport also had a hard reset on almost all the visual aspects of the game, similar to what GT3 did, where the car and track list decreased dramatically from its predecessor, especially at launch, but that was so all of the models and textures could take full advantage of the hardware they were being built for, as every single car in Sport was remodeled for the 8th gen consoles it was made for. This also extended to the sound design of the game. If you've wondered why I haven't mentioned sound much in the previous installments, it's because every GT after 2 wasn't exactly groundbreaking for their time in terms of car or environmental sounds, in some cases actually being kind of bad for their time. Now with Sport, they completely reworked the car sounds. Give it a listen. think these sound pretty good. As a final note, Polyphony did eventually address player feedback and started adding back and filling out a proper Gran Turismo style progression, meaning that now, this is one of the better games to play in the series for almost every kind of player. Although, Polyphony didn't stop trying to change the core foundation of Gran Turismo with Sport, but we'd only find that out much later. Gran Turismo 7 was disliked almost immediately after release, being hailed as a critical success while almost universally being panned by players. This was down to the fact that at launch, and for a decent while after, many of the game's most unique and historically important cars were locked behind millions of credits, with the game giving the player two options to afford them. A. Dump tens of hours into the single player and grind out events just to afford a single car, or B. Pay up. This didn't sit well with anyone, and after enough backlash from players and critics, they eventually started increasing payouts and events to make it easier for players to experience the game in full. But as much as the media attention may have placed all of GT7's failings at a botched microtransaction feature, it was far from the only issues it had. Rafflewaffle put out a full series of videos detailing all of its shortcomings, but here's the Cliff's Notes version. The single player progression was removed, again like in GT Sport, but it was done in such a way that was arguably more insulting to longtime fans of the series. Before GT7 released, it was marketed as a return to form for the series. It wasn't GT Sport 2, it wasn't GT Manager, it wasn't Tourist Trophy 2, it was Gran Turismo 7. And all the promotional material said as such, so people were expecting a classic Gran Turismo single-player experience. We did not get that. Instead, we got these cafe menu books that are at best a short single-player progression that spends about as much time telling you about the cars you just got as you spent getting them, and at worst, it's a kind of tutorial battle pass hybrid that is too long by either standard. You could also just skip much of it by just buying the required cars and moving on. The races themselves became a bit of a joke as the AI were as oblivious and inconsistent as ever, but they also made it where nearly all single-player races consisted of a rolling start, with every opponent several seconds ahead of the last. This usually led to the player either being significantly faster than the AI was prepared for, and leaving them behind with a lap to spare, or still being 1 mile back while crossing the final straight. The AI also rubber banded on a level only comparable to Need for Speed Underground 1, except now they slow to a comparative crawl when you fall too far back. They also added Forza wheel spins that are almost more insulting than the ones from those games, because instead of giving you a hypercar or enough money to get a one-bedroom apartment in LA, you get a car that you don't care about, a part for a car you don't care about, or some pocket change. Now, those are the issues with GT7 that I thought were the most notable, but the thing is, that doesn't mean I think this is a bad racing game. Just a bad Gran Turismo game. As a racing game, this is still one of the best to come out in recent memory. On the surface, this is one of the best games out now for its physics that feel both amazing on wheel and controller, and its graphics that look immaculate in all environments and conditions. It also keeps the escapes and sports modes from GT Sport, and while it didn't change or improve the functionality of them much, they are welcome additions to all GT games in the future. They also added Music Rally, which is one of the game modes of all time. Actually, as a final note, Sport Mode does display one of the best parts of GT7, the Gran Turismo community. I actually think the GT community is one of its biggest strengths, and as basically any racing game content creator will tell you, it's leagues ahead of the man-children found in the NFS community and the literal children of the Forza community.
I would just guess they're like normal-ish, like they're not toxic, like let's say Need for Speed community is with the latest game and all that.
Gran Turismo community in general is significantly better than some of the other mainline racing games nowadays.
Yeah.
I think the Gran Turismo community has done pretty well in just separating themselves into two bubbles. the bubble that is, you know, mostly fond of the old school stuff, and they, you know, interact with the old school stuff, etc., etc. And then the new school audience that are just happy just playing their 7 or playing their sport, you know, every weekend or whatever. So honestly, like the GT community feels very like, as if I were to compare it to, let's say, the Need for Speed community, very non-confrontative.
Honestly, compared to Forza and Need for Speed, pretty good. Gran Turismo community, they're pretty chill now. I mean, I made a video, you know, so many videos and then a massive series just tearing apart GT7. But the majority of people, even people who enjoy the game, can look at it and say, yeah, they screwed up some stuff here. You know, they can look at it objectively.
The GT community is just chill. You can see this in both how they drive on track by respecting other space and not dive bombing every chance they get, and in how they interact with each other. Like, many of you will likely disagree with what I have to say in this video, and that's fine, but I know the number of you who would be arrogant and obnoxious about it is a fraction of what it would be if this was an NFS video, and I respect that. On the whole, I think Gran Turismo is a contender for one of the greatest video game franchises of all time, and is a must-play for anyone with the slightest interest in cars. Anyway, shout out to all the creators that got to help me with this, particularly Xboss, who helped with getting some extra GT7 footage. And if you want to see more GT stuff, I'm currently playing through all of them in order on my Twitch, and I'm coming up on GT4, so if you want to see that, the link is down below. I guess I'll see y'all there.